So I'm out in the vegetable garden just checking on, well, anything. There's nothing happening here now. In the 4 small beds here, I planted a bunch of bulbs in fall, and so I was just checking to see if maybe there might be any sign of those coming up. And this is a giant block of ice. All of the beds are still ice cubes, so nothing's coming up yet. So it'll be a little bit of a wait, but it'll be so worth it when it comes. There are a few daffodils starting to poke up around the garden that are in the ground though, so that's something. So earlier this week I asked on Instagram if anyone had any questions, and I got a bunch of questions from people, and so I thought we're just going to do a general garden Q&A about gardening questions. So rather than sitting at my kitchen table and doing it, I thought we'd do it kind of in the garden, even though it's very cold here today. It's like not even above freezing here today, so I'm going to have to talk quick. Dorothy's trying to walk around the camera right now, so if it just, there. Hi. Okay, so let's just roll into the questions. Knockwhat says, I'm confused about tulip and daffodil bulbs. I want to plant them in fall for next spring, but I don't understand. Do I dig them out once they've bloomed? And if not, how do I remember where they are so I don't accidentally dig them up while planting other things? So 2 things, yes, you definitely want to plant daffodils and tulips in fall for spring, so you've got that right. In most cases, you're going to leave these in the ground. And I say in most cases because in some places tulips don't overwinter super well. So a lot of times people either consider them annuals or they do dig them out and chill them, and it's kind of a pain to dig them out. So if I was in a place where they didn't overwinter, I would probably just consider them an annual and let them just do their thing in the ground. But in places where it gets cold, it's all about a chill period for those bulbs. So in places where it gets cool, those bulbs will come back. You don't have to do anything. Tulips maybe come back for, well, it all depends on the variety, but you know, they come back for a number of years. Daffodils come back for a long time. So how do you know where they are? Well, that's the thing. You don't really. I mean, I suppose some people might actually make a note of where they are or even label some. I have never done that. I just stick them in. And how do you avoid digging them up? Well, I mean, I guess ideally in a perfect world, you'd plant your whole garden and then you'd plant your bulbs, and you'd sort of plant them so that they're kind of tucked under perennials so the foliage can last for a long time and get all that strength back into the bulb, and then you'd cut it back. I don't live in that perfect world, and you probably don't either. So what do? I just dig and I plant where I need to plant, and if I pull up a daffodil bulb in the process, I just stick it back in the ground. 99% of the time, unless you've cut the bulb in half, it's just fine. I mean, yes, you'll lose some throughout the way, but it's not a big deal. They're tough plants. You just stick them back in and they're good to go. Answer True says, I'd love to hear about some of your top picks for flower seeds that you can still start inside. I'm hoping to start a few more things to my indoor seedling start soon. To be honest with you, there's a lot of flowers that I haven't started, that I'm starting inside, that I haven't started yet, or I just started this weekend. I just did celosia, am I saying that right? Celosia, I think so, and marigolds this weekend. I haven't yet started things like amaranth, hyacinth bean, nasturtium, ceranth, ageratum. Those are all coming up soon though. And then of course, keep in mind that there's some great direct sowing flowers. Cosmos and zinnias are the 2 that always come to my mind, that you can sow directly in the soil. So you can do those obviously, but you don't need to take up space in your inside in your lights for those things. Also keep in mind things like flowering herbs. Basil, I haven't started that yet, although that's coming up soon, but there's some really beautiful basils that have great flowers, and other things that are kind of pretty that you wouldn't think of as necessarily a flower first. There's some opportunities there. Since we're in the vegetable garden, this next question is appropriate. This is from Mara Jadeski. Pardon me if I'm pronouncing anyone's Instagram handles incorrectly here. I'm doing my best. Which veggies and fruit grow in shade versus sun? I'm growing plants for a local nonprofit to help the food pantry get fresh produce. Such a good question, and that's so great that you're growing for a food pantry this year. I think this year in particular, they're really going to need that. Boy, what a good year it would be to just do something nice for other people, and growing is such a good way to do it, and everyone's going to be really looking for that, I think. So there's a lot of things you can grow in. I mean, I think full shade, you're not going to grow anything edible probably in most full shade situations, but In dappled shade or part shade, there's lots you can grow. And look mostly to like leafy greens, lettuce, spinach, arugula, things like bok choy, mustard greens, all of those grow really well. Swiss chard probably falls into that category. So a lot of those leafy greens grow really well. Other things like, kale, you can do that with beets. A lot of herbs, mint I think grows anywhere. Just make sure you contain it because it will grow anywhere. Keep it in a pot. Parsley does well in part shade. Even things like some of the winter squashes like butternut tends to do okay in sort of a part shade situation. So there are a ton of things that you can grow in part shade. I think the things you want to avoid in a part shade situation or a shady situation are things like tomatoes, peppers, basil, potatoes, cucumbers. Those all really want sun. So probably just don't bother with those things, but stick to all those good leafy greens. And the good thing is that those are easy to grow. You can grow a lot of them. If you keep succession sowing with those, you can produce a lot of food, and it's really healthy, nutritious, important food. So that would be great to grow. So I haven't done much in the garden, by the way. I've been trying to hold off on my garden cleanup a little bit, just trying to be a little bit more conscientious about insects that are overwintering in places and not be too particular too soon. So I've not really cleaned up much. I have cut back grasses and things like that and done a little bit of pruning, as you've seen in some other videos, but I've not cleaned up any beds or anything like that. Okay, so while we're walking, we'll talk about the next question. So Lorelei Lee says, if you start your seeds indoors, what's the process like using a cold frame to get them outside? And then a similar question was from We Wonderfuls, who said, I saw your plastic greenhouse in your yard in one of your videos and was wondering when you put the plants out in it. So yes, so over here is, well, actually right now we've got a bit of a burn pile developing over here, but every year I put up a plastic greenhouse. I'll put a link to it. It works really well for what I use it for. It's definitely not a permanent structure in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so behind me is where I usually put that little greenhouse. It doesn't matter where you put it, just in a nice sunny spot. So it functions basically as a cold frame because it's not that protective. And so I will put it up soon, and I will start moving seedlings out there, the cold hardy ones like sweet peas and onions. Those are things that can handle cold. I will put those out in part just to make room inside from my seed starting area, but also because it can get too warm inside for them to want to grow. So I will move those out here as soon as the nights are consistently above freezing. We're still getting, I mean, it's below freezing right now, so obviously at night it's below freezing. So maybe in a week or 2 weeks I will start doing that. The key is to not move out the things that really want the warmth, like a lot of annual vines, basil, tomatoes, stuff like that cannot go outside until it's much, much, much warmer. And what I do is when I put them out there, I just cover them up with a little bit of that harvest guard to A, help them transition to the sun, and B, give them a little bit of protection at night. I leave that on for maybe a week or so, and then take that off, and then they're pretty much good in there. If we get a really cold night, I will sometimes take like a 5-gallon bucket of hot water from inside and stick it in the greenhouse to offer some residual heat through the night to kind of just bring that temperature up just a degree or two maybe. And I will cover things back up if it's going to be really cold, like it is right now. My hands are freezing. Squirrel Cardinal said, do you have tips for making a natural looking woodland garden? You know what? I got to move the camera because I can't stand into the wind like this because I'm freezing. Let's move it over by a natural woodland garden. Sorry that I'm hitting the tripod here, you guys. Okay. Oh, this is so much better over here. Thank God. Okay. Natural woodland garden. So a person who does this really well and has great information on this is Margaret Roach of A Way to Garden. So go to her website. She talks a lot about sort of a tapestry, mosaic type planting. And what she sort of advocates is starting with small plants that you sort of tuck in, because Obviously, shade usually means you're dealing with a lot of roots of trees. That's why it's shady, and that's the same reason why it's dry. So start with small plants and kind of tuck them in and try to create essentially like almost a mat of plants, but sort of an interwoven planting scheme. Things like epimediums are really good, especially for that dry. Everything is going to need to be watered for that first year. You can't just plant in the ground and walk away. It's still going to need to help getting established. And a lot of those woodland type plants really like the kind of soil that you'd find in a woodland, which is really nice, crumbly. Well, it's like leaves. It's the stuff you'd find if you went and walked in the woods. That's what those woodland type plants like. So the more you can do of letting things be a little natural in there in terms of letting leaves just kind of break down or adding leaf mold to that soil, that will help that situation quite a bit. And then I think in terms of a natural looking one, the key is to just sort of let it flow, try to cover the area with things and not be too particular about, you know, a specific hosta here and a specific hosta there. Obviously you want a planting scheme, but help it all flow together, and I think that will help a lot. Okay, Ksev says, when do you bring the pots out of your garage that you are overwintering? Oh, good question. Very, very soon. So as you guys know, I grow a lot of, I have roses in pots and I have a boxwood in a pot. So I bring all those, and those overwinter in my unheated garage. I will bring all those out any day now. It's time to start acclimating them. They're all perennials. They'll all be fine temperature wise outside. The key is to do it really slowly, because what I've learned is you can't just bring them out and stick them in the sun. So you got to bring them out, keep them in shade. I use that harvest guard again. I even will put like a little bit of burlap over it. You need to acclimate them to more light because they've been in a dark garage basically all winter, very, very slowly. And then you also need to add water and make sure that they're well watered but not soaking in water, and just really gradually acclimate them. What kind of potting mix do you use for your outdoor pots? Do you think it makes any difference? That's from, oh, I lost track of who asked that question, so I apologize for that. Yeah, it makes a big difference. I'm really fussy about potting mix. I do not like potting mixes that have a fertilizer built into them. I like to be able to control the level of fertilizer that's in them. I also don't like potting mixes. I mean, almost all potting mixes in the US have peat in them. I don't like the ones that are made up of a ton of peat, because once those dry out, it's almost impossible to get those re-wetted again. The organic potting mixes tend to have a lot more bulk and leaf mold and things like that worked into them, so you don't have that problem as much. So those are quite good. I do sometimes mix in some stuff with my potting mixes. I'll take like what they call pine bark fines, which are tiny little pieces of bark basically, and mix that in to add in some drainage and more organic material. And then I add my own fertilizer as I see fit. I don't care for the ones that have that in. And I never, ever buy the ones that have that soil moist stuff in it. I think that stuff is weird, and I'd much rather just water my plants properly and thoroughly and not worry about that soil moist stuff. I'm not sure how well that stuff works. So it's just, that's my preference. You guys probably have your favorites, but the question was what I like. That's what I like. Fitz and Fanny, who I see often on Instagram, says, what are some container plant ideas for mostly shade but hot afternoon sun? Everything I've tried gets scorched. That's a super tough spot. And I would say, you know, maybe look, first of all, maybe start thinking more about foliage, because a lot of times, I think you can push a lot of sun plants into a condition like that, but you're going to lack flowers. I mean, sun plants are going to flower best when they're in full sun. So you can push a lot into that, but it's hard to do that. And then of course, if you end up the other way, like you said, you end up scorching things. But there are a lot of plants with beautiful foliage that can adapt much easier to sun or shade. So Coleus is one that comes to mind right away. Some of the new caladiums do both sun or shade. So I would start looking at color that's not necessarily done with foliage. I think there's some begonias that can handle you know, a pretty broad range. So take a look at those. Like for instance, like the Surefire begonias from Proven Winners. I always plant those in blazing sun, but I've also planted them in a fair amount of shade and they've done well. But definitely, and I would say when you're looking at plants, I'd actually lean more towards plants that say they're for sun or part sun than plants that say they're for shade, because things that are for shade often really want shade, and they will turn crispy when you get them in that hot afternoon sun. Oh, hey, let's move for this next question. I'll tell you the question while we're walking around the yard here. Okay, so Tammy Codner says, how is your outdoor gallon seed starting going? Well, let's go check out the winter sowing containers, which are around the front here. Do you guys notice how this tree right here is at an angle? That's an apple tree that a deer came along and pushed over. So that was handy. Okay, I've got everything out here. This is on the south side of the house. This is about the warmest spot they're gonna find this time of year. And let's see how they're all doing. Nothing is happening in any of them yet. It's just been, at least they're thawed now. The other day when I picked them up, they were like ice cubes. Nothing's happening. So that doesn't surprise me. It's just cold here, you guys. The other day on Instagram, I posted that I was all fired up because I was going to watch the new season of Gardener's World just started. And so I was going to watch, and so a ton of people asked me where I was watching it. So Gardener's World is a British gardening television show starring Monty Don and a bunch of other amazing gardeners. And it is food for the soul, especially right now. So I watched that show on BritBox, which you can get a BritBox subscription in a couple different places. I just get it through Amazon Prime. I think it's $6 a month or maybe $7 a month. And you get all these other British TV shows too. But you can also watch, they have last season's Gardener's Worlds on there, so I rewatch those all the time. And they have last year's Chelsea garden show, which unfortunately was canceled for this year on there. So there's a lot of good gardening content on there, plus good British murder mystery stuff and all that kind of thing. So that is where I watched that show. You can watch it on YouTube. People put it up on YouTube, but that they tend to get taken down quickly, so you can't really share links to that stuff. And you know, really, it's content I'm happy to pay for because I love it. I would pay $6, even if I only watched just that show on it, I'd pay that $6 every month with no problem. Hey, while we're over here, do you guys know what this thing is? This is a tree wrap deal, and I'm gonna go put it on a tree. So let's answer the rest of the questions over there. Okay, so here's the deal with this tree. This great tree, it's been doing really well here. And then last fall I looked and I noticed, actually in the middle of winter, I noticed that the deer had rubbed all the bark off it. So we had an emergency trip to the hardware store, and the best thing my husband could find was like a gutter, which we're basically holding on there. But I found some tree wrap, which will do a better job and is far less ugly at protecting this. So I thought I'd put that on. Oh my gosh. Can you see how bad this is? Oh, hopefully this tree will come back okay from that. But anyways, I got this like a vinyl tree wrap thing at a nursery, and I think that will be better. How and when did you get into gardening? So when I was a kid, my mom was a big gardener. She still is, and so we were always around gardening, although I don't remember being really a big part of that. I know we grew stuff, but I don't remember it being like a really big deal that we were involved in. And then that was sort of there in the back of my brain. And then when I left college and got my first apartment, I moved into this super cheap, really kind of icky apartment. And of course, in an apartment, you couldn't change anything. You can't paint a wall. You can't do anything in an apartment. At least you couldn't then. I mean, now there's like, you know, removable wallpaper and stuff. But back then, you couldn't do anything. You moved into an apartment and what was there was what was there. So I was desperate to put my stamp and have anything I could control in this apartment. So there was a tiny little balcony, and I put a window box out there. It faced north. It was basically a disaster. But I did a lot of research trying to figure out what I could plant there, and I really got into it, and that was where it started. And then in my next apartment after that, we had a little patio that was actually west facing, and we filled that up with a ton of container plants. And that's actually the last place we lived before we bought this house, because at that point my, well, now husband said, you know, we've run out of room on that patio. I think we got to go someplace where we can get you a place to grow more. And that's how we got here. Tasha's Life said, what's a plant that you regret planting? I have two that come to mind immediately. The first one is an Artemisia called Limelight, not to be confused with the Limelight Hydrangea. And it was this beautiful variegated one. It was kind of, well, lime and green. I still find that thing popping up in my garden. It went everywhere immediately. It was pretty tall. It wasn't nearly as pretty as you'd think it was, and I still find that some places. And the other one was a Coreopsis, and I don't know what kind it was, but I got it, I think, maybe from my mom's garden right when we moved in and I started gardening, and it took over and it went everywhere. And it was that really gold yellow color, which I don't really love. And I actually finally did rid my garden of that plant. And I didn't plant anything that color until, well, for like 15 years basically, because I was so traumatized from that plant. So, by the way, I do now have other Coreopsis in my garden, and they're nice plants. They behave much better. That one, well, there's a reason they call it, one of the common names for Coreopsis is tick seed. I feel like anytime seed is in the common name, it often means that it seeds everywhere. Darlene Old said, what is your favorite rose and why? I don't really have a favorite rose because I'm not great at growing roses, to be perfectly honest. I love the David Austin roses because they're just so blousy and beautiful, and they have scent. And there are a lot of really good roses. I grow several Oh So Easy roses that I think are really good performers, but I almost don't in my head think of them as roses because they don't have that scent. And I've sort of decided that it's not really a rose if it doesn't have all the parts of being a rose, and for me that's scent. So I do grow several David Austins. I wouldn't say I grow any of them particularly well, but they manage, and I love them, and they're very pretty. Okay, a lot of people ask me a question. How do you keep your dogs from peeing on your plants? I don't. I yell. I will say I've done a pretty good job of, well, generally speaking, our dogs are pretty good about staying out of the garden beds themselves when there are plants growing in them. In winter and when there's nothing there, it's really, they seem to have a difficult time distinguishing like where's an area what's different from grass than a garden bed. But when anything's growing there, they stay out of the garden beds. But we do have Odin, of course, is a boy, and he will pee on things. So I spend a lot of time, you know, keeping an eye on them, especially when they're young, to make sure that they understand that they are not to do that. And he is particularly bad about boxwoods. He has killed, I'm going to say, easily 12 boxwoods. I think it's that sort of cat pee smell that some types of boxwood have, and that's maybe what it's about. I don't know, but he fries boxwoods all the time, and it's really frustrating. So that's it. I don't do anything else except I yell at my dog. Well, I'll tell you what, let's move on to a different location. But in the meantime, let me show you what's in the woods before we walk out of here. The skunk cabbage, which is native here. I didn't plant any of these. These are just here. This is a pretty damp area over here, so they like it here. Are all coming up. The purple is actually sort of the calyx, I think, and there's a tiny little flower inside of there, but the green that you see are the leaves just starting to come up. They are all over, and they're lovely and wonderful. I've come to the conclusion that I'm probably going to have to start planting a different centerpiece plant in each one of the segments in the circle garden, because Odin does get all these. So this one is still looking pretty good, although who knows. That one's in fairly good shape. But if you look over here, that's what that one looks like. And this one, which is closest, I mean, there's like nothing left of this one. So that's what my dog does to boxwoods. And MS Mensch said, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, said, I just bought my first house last June and I barely had time to create some beds. By the way, that's the time of year we moved into this house, so I know exactly what you're talking about there. My yard is a blank slate right now. I too am impatient and I want it all beautiful right now. How do you cultivate patience and enjoy the process to someone for whom it doesn't come naturally to? Well, we are like peas from the same pod there. That's me. We bought this house in June. I just wanted to rip everything out. I just wanted to start doing things. And there's a reason I have called myself the impatient gardener. It's so true. I'm super impatient. I've gotten better over the years. But so how do I manage that? I don't know what to say because I feel like I wasn't very good at not being patient. But I will tell you that I think that's why I have so many different gardens, because I would work on one, I'd really focus on one area, and then I'd get that planted, and then there's nothing to do but wait. At one point, you can't do anymore. So that's when I started making like the next garden. And I would say maybe that's the thing to do, is sort of, you know, focus on one thing, get it to the point where you're happy with it, and then pick up something else where you can kind of take your mind off of the garden that's supposed to be growing. Because it helps that a little bit. Your mind is busy worrying about other things, and all of a sudden one day you turn around and your garden has filled in and it's beautiful and it looks great. Containers are a great thing for that because you can change up containers a lot, and it's sort of a low commitment kind of things that keeps you busy for a while. Laura Ashley 1215 said, I just bought a house. How on earth do I go about planning garden spaces? Most importantly, how do I prioritize everything I want to do? So I talked a little bit about this in the garden design video that I talked about, but I would say if you're in a new area, I would prioritize the areas that are either closest to your house or that you spend the most time in, because these are the areas, you want those areas to look nice. Have nice places for yourself to be in while you work on other areas. Also, I would say do check out Yulia's at Why Garden or Why Do You Garden. Her website, she did a whole, or excuse me, her YouTube channel, she did a whole series on garden design, and she's actually a garden designer, so she explains it really well. So check that out, and that might be helpful. But I would say prioritize an area that you want to be in the most or that you see the most. Start there, get that right, and then you can move on to other areas. Diamonds and Hemp said, actually, we're going to save that question for last because it's a little different than the rest of them. And Yo Yang, how do you keep weeds under control? What's your advice on organic gardening? So weeds, you just got to stay on top of them. I pull them, I dig them out. I feel like that's the only real way you ever get, you know, if you pull out a weed and you get it out, roots and all, one and done. You're done with it then. You never have to deal with it again. If you're doing something else with it, spraying it or hoeing it off and leaving the roots still in there, it's going to come back. So you might as well just do it one and done. So I pull weeds mostly. In areas where I'm able to, I use a weed torch, which is very fun. So I do that on gravel paths or like cracks in like the patio or something. I will do them there somewhere where it's safe to do that. Weed burning works best if you get those weeds when they're tiny little sprouts. And you probably will have to do that like twice or 3 times, and you're not trying to incinerate the weeds, you're trying to desiccate them. So when you do weed burning, you put the flame on it and you wait until those leaves get bright green. And what that is going to do is it's going to pull all the moisture out of that, and so it'll gradually desiccate. And that's how you're going to be killing those roots, is you're depriving those roots, but you are probably going to hit them a couple of times. But for big areas, it works pretty well. As far, and smothering. Occasionally I will, if I have a big area, I will do some sort of smothering type of thing. Just don't let them get a foothold. And if you can't do one of those other things, just stay on top of them. Like for instance, I will do hoeing in a case like that, because if you can't get in there to dig them all, it's still better to chop their heads off so they don't get a chance to grow and produce seed and, you know, proliferate. Organic gardening, my advice on organic gardening is do it. I love it. I mean, I garden organically almost exclusively. There are exceptions for me, but mostly my garden is organic. In the beginning, organic gardening can seem like it's more work because you have to give nature a little bit of a chance to balance itself out. But once you get that balance in, a lot of your garden problems disappear because other parts, the ecosystem in your garden gets more balanced, and things start to, so you have fewer pest problems because there's birds in your garden to eat those bugs, or there's something else that eats those bugs, or there's toads and frogs to eat the slugs. Things have a way of balancing themselves out, but it does take a little bit to get there. So in the beginning, it might be a little bit more work, and you might have to be like hand picking bugs or something like that. But it manages itself, and my garden is better for it, for sure. Jay Shepet says, purslane takes over my garden. How do I get rid of it? I do not have that problem here, but purslane I know can be really bad in some places. And so I did a little research into purslane. I mean, we do have some, but not super bad. So purslane, by the way, is apparently edible, and a lot of people tell you just eat it. But people who have a major purslane problem, well, A, they don't even want to look at it, but second of all, you can't just eat it all. I looked it up. One plant can produce 240,000 seeds, and those seeds can lay latent in the soil and germinate for up to 40 years. So no wonder it's a problem, right? It also will reroot. So if you like take a hoe to it and chop it off, well, those sort of succulent stems will just reroot. So if you're going to do that, you got to make sure you clean it up and get it out of there. The advice that I found from university websites seems to suggest that the best thing to do is to smother it or solarize it. So solarizing is where you put like a big sheet of plastic down for like 4 to 6 weeks, and you cook it. Like you are cooking you're essentially creating a greenhouse underneath there. And you're basically, but you want to do that like at the hottest part of summer. It means giving up a good part of your garden for several weeks, almost 2 months. So that's hard to do, and sometimes you just can't do that. But smothering is a pretty good idea, and so the thing to do is lay down thick mulch, like minimum of 3 inches. I'd go deeper than that, and just lay it on top of there and work on smothering, and then pull it as it comes through and try to get a handle on it that way. Bree Dawson says, can you recommend any good gardening books? Oh, heck yes, I can. I have some reviews on my website of garden books that I've done reviews on, but I'm going to do a whole video on it because a lot of people are looking for garden books now because suddenly we've all found ourselves with some time. Well, The Weeds of Life says, could you share some tips or advice on how you decide what plants you want to place in a new garden? There's so many options, it gets overwhelming when choosing. I can. Because I actually just went through this when I was working on the design for the new garden that's just going to be right over here. Because I want all the plants, but you know that a design is better when you've got fewer plants. So here's what I would say. Start with a very realistic inventory of the conditions you have. So what's your soil like? What's your sun like? What's the exposure like? Is it windy or protected? Acidity of your soil, all of those things. Start with those things, and then that rules out a whole bunch of plants. Just don't try to stretch a plant don't try to make the area you're working in fit the plant you want to plant there. Start with your conditions that you have, and then pick the plant that works best in those kinds of areas. So that will rule out a whole host of things. Then I would say, think about the vision for your garden, what style of garden you want there. This is where Pinterest and places like that can really come in handy. And that will help you narrow down your plant palette, as well as color, if you've got a color theme in mind. And then I think you start getting down to things like texture. You're going to want an array of textures. You don't want all fine leaf plants or all thick leaf plants. Texture is almost more important than anything else in a garden, I think. So pay close attention to making sure you have different textures, and then look at bloom time for plants. So try to make sure that you've got either blooms or something interesting in your garden at all times of the year. And I think once you start doing that, it's really easy to weed out a lot of plants, and suddenly you realize you don't have that big of a palette to work from. And then I did see some garden designers say the other day, so you make your list of plants, you do all that, and then you edit it down from there. This was actually reminded me a little bit of an exercise that we used to do in journalism school. We had one professor who would make us write a story, and we'd turn it in, and then she'd hand it back to us and say, okay, now cut it in half. And it was an exercise in editing. We all, by the way, wisened up to that and started making it extra long. So it only worked like twice. But it's the same thing with a plant palette. Do it, edit it down, and then edit further. How do you know when it's time to prune your hydrangeas? Mine are over 4 years old and I'm scared they won't come back. And yes, I have watched you cut yours down in horror. I laugh about this because I made that hydrangea pruning video last year and like a lot of people went crazy and thought I was hacking. So I had to actually make a follow-up video where I showed them that everything was alive and looking great. So the first thing is start with what kind of hydrangea they are. You got to know what kind of hydrangea it is. If you can't figure out what kind of hydrangea it is, stop. Don't do anything. Watch it for a year. You'll figure out what it is, and then you can prune it appropriately the next year. It's better to not prune anything than accidentally prune something, unless you're worried about, I mean, if you don't care whether you have flowers or not, then it doesn't really matter, but we're not growing hydrangeas for the foliage, generally speaking. So I would say, you know, when you're thinking like if you've got new plants, like when you plant them, I would have pruned plants by the time they're hydrangeas by the time they're 4 years old. So how do they look when they're blooming? Are they blooming well? How's the shape of them? Do you have, I mean, no matter what kind of plant you have, if you've got crossing branches or diseased branches or dead branches, those got to go no matter what. So those should be getting out of there at any time, and the sooner the better. I would also say Proven Winners has a great hydrangea pruning guide worksheet. I will put a link to it. It really walks you through when to prune what. It's very helpful if you're just trying to get a feel for it. So that's something too. And by the way, anything I'm mentioning here, I will put links in the description, so make sure you check that. Crud3 says, I live in Utah, rocky and clay soil. I'm going to remove 6 to 10 feet of lawn in front of my fence for flower beds. When I remove the lawn, how would you prep the existing soil? Should I bring in bulk soil from a nursery? You know, I wouldn't. I would say, you know, I think if you just throw soil that is completely unlike what you have on top of a garden, I don't think it's really going to work, because unless you're talking about almost creating a raised bed situation with like feet of soil, it's probably not going to work great. So what I would say is try to plan your planting for plants that will work in the soil that you have. And then especially in the case of, since you're talking about clay, gypsum can help break up clay a little bit. And I think the best thing to do for clay soil is amend rather slowly, to be honest. It's not a good idea to really get in there and like really rip things through with a tiller. You might have to do it once when you first start that bed, but I wouldn't do it every year. You can create giant hard clumps of clay with a tiller that they will just turn into rocks. So maybe get some compost, organic matter, leaf mold, things like that. Work that in a little bit, but make sure that you're still planting things that are going to work in that kind of soil that you have. And then gradually over the years, just work really hard on getting a layer of compost on there, a layer of leaf mold, organic material. And I wouldn't even worry about working it into the soil. It will get worked in itself. And if you do that year after year after year, you will have some really nice soil and things will start to grow a little better. But I think it is going to be a process. Should we move? We've been standing in this spot for a while. I didn't move far because I'm trying to stay on the warm side of the house and my hands are getting cold. The Cobblestone Cottage 48353 says, I need a hydrangea for the north side of the cottage that will do okay in some shade or maybe some other kind of cool flowering shrub. So I checked out where Cobblestone Cottage lives, and she's in Michigan. So I would be personally very reluctant to try to grow a hydrangea on the north side of a house, assuming that it's a relatively shady spot. In Michigan, most of them, you might be able to pull that off like in the south where it's warmer and sunnier, but not probably in Michigan would be my guess. So I would look to other flowering shrubs that aren't going to handle like full shade, but they'll handle a shadier situation better. So some of them that I came up with were Sweet Spire, that's also known as Itea. If you have acidic soil, look at rhododendron. We do not have acidic soil here, so I could never grow a rhododendron. Although my mom grows some, so maybe I could. Elderberry and bottlebrush buckeye, which the species is quite big, but it's a very cool plant. In fact, I'm hoping to grow some of those myself this year over there. Okay, Oksana Isbradini, sorry, says, I'd like to hear your personal preferences with regard to white hydrangeas. You've got Incredible, Annabelle, Bobo and Limelight. You've been studying. Between Annabelle and Incredible, which one do you find is more floriferous and holds its white color longer? Do you find that Incredible flops as well? If you had to plant a hydrangea in a bright spot but without direct sunlight, which would you plant? As for Limelight, yours seems to be a mini tree. Did you prune it that way or is it grafted? Okay, lots of questions there. We'll just whip through them quick. So Incredible is, Annabelle is a parent to Incredible. So they share a lot of common traits. The main thing is that Incredible has stronger stems and much bigger flowers, big giant basketball sized flowers. So first of all, I would say in terms of holding their color, I think it's about the same. I don't notice a lot of difference. If anything, maybe Incredible, but I would say in terms of holding their white color, I would say they're about the same. Incredible does flop for me. It doesn't so much as the whole branch goes down as it sort of arches down with those big things. Not as badly as Annabelle, but it does still do that. So it's not impervious to that. And you'll see some pictures that I've posted over the years where you can tell that things are starting to sort of list a little bit. If you had to plant a hydrangea in a bright spot without direct sunlight, which would you plant? Tough call, and again, same as the question before this, it depends a lot on where you're living, how warm your area is to begin with. Annabelle does pretty good. I have Annabelle that kind of bends around the north corner of the house and it still blooms pretty good over there, so that's one I would consider. Because I would say that Annabelle has more flowers versus Incredible. Incredible has much bigger flowers, Annabelle has more flowers. At least in my garden. Oh, and as for the Limelight, she said mine looks like a Brinny tree. It's not. They do sell Limelights that are standardized, and that is a grafted situation. I think those are, I don't know if those are grafts actually, or if they're trained that way, but that's not what I have. I just have mine, over the years I have pruned mine to have sort of 3 main stems. So it's a multi-stemmed shrub situation. And I just clean those out just to kind of keep it, I didn't want it going super wide at the bottom. So it sort of gets it kind of a vase shape. And that's all pruning. R Moyles 82 says, what would you recommend for a tall 6 to 8 foot narrow shade plant or grass? I need something for privacy on the north side of my home. The area is about 4 feet wide. I have bad news for you. I would recommend a fence. That's not what you want to hear. I know that, but it's going to be almost impossible to find something. You might find something like shrubbier that you could kind of grow in those conditions. But in a 4 foot wide area, I can't think of anything. So I would say you're probably looking at a fence. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we're on to that last question that I just wanted to go back to. First of all, I just wanted to say, I did put a little something up on IGTV about just everything that's going on right now. So I don't want to, it just talks a little bit about how I don't want to ignore everything that's happening because this is all a part of our lives right now. But I also know that this is a bit of a refuge and I want gardening to remain a refuge for all of us, frankly. So Diamonds and Hemp asked a question kind of related to what's going on in the world right now. She says, I live in central Pennsylvania and our state just closed all life-sustaining places. Any tips on what to do when nurseries are closed? I have big plans for this spring, but I fear they may be spoiled. I just talked to a local garden center about this yesterday, actually. And, you know, the problem is nobody knows. Nobody knows if the places that are currently in a, essential services only situation are going to stay that way for very long. We don't know if Wisconsin's not there yet. I suspect it's coming this week, to be honest. No one knows how long any of this is going to last. I think we all hope and pray it won't last very long, and we're going to be well on the way to figuring out a way out of this. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but no one knows, so we can't control that. So first of all, I would say I am really encouraging people to reach out to, if you're not in this essential services thing, in which case I don't know that garden centers are able to do much about it, although some states are, landscaping companies are considered essential services, so I'm not sure where that falls. Call your local garden center that you like to use, especially an independent garden center will be able to help with this, I think. And ask them where they're at in this whole thing, regardless of what's happening right now, because maybe the situation will change. Hopefully we will get to a situation in which local garden centers will at the very least be able to offer, pay ahead, place an order over the phone, and pay ahead, and you can swing by and they can stick it in your car. I would say that's what you should think about doing first, if that is a service that would be offered, because we are going to need those local garden centers and those independent garden centers so much when this is all over. We're all going to want a garden. We don't want those to go away. So most of those places have already ordered their plants. It's not like they can cancel their plant orders now. We want them to survive. So support them if you are at all able. Keep in mind that if that's not an option for you, online plant ordering is still available. You can still get deliveries. I do buy a lot of plants online. I generally buy only plants that I can't find locally online, so usually something a little rarer, but look online if you can't do that. I would say if you're going to do some plant shopping online, the time to do it is sooner rather than later, because I think a lot of people are going to be looking to do plant shopping online this year. And worst case scenario, let's say you just can't get plants, start looking at what you can divide in your own garden. I mean, we probably all should divide our perennials more often than we do. I know I hardly ever divide anything, and gardens would be better for it. So look what you can get from your own garden. If it is, maybe work with a gardening friend or a neighbor who has some things, and maybe you can trade some plants safely, keeping social distancing in mind and all of those things. Or worst case scenario, buy yourself some seeds for some flowering annuals. And if nothing else, if all else fails, go out there and plant a garden full of zinnias or a garden full of cosmos or whatever you can find. And maybe we just all have beautiful gardens that were not what we planned, but they're still flowering and they're beautiful and they're food for our souls this year. We're going to just have to change it up as we go along. I would say too, especially, somebody mentioned earlier in one of the questions that they're growing food for a food pantry, maybe grab some seeds and change some of your garden into, you can have very ornamental vegetables. Maybe you want to grow some of those. We might just have to kind of wing it this year. We don't know what's going to come. So those are some ideas, and I think I'll just do the best we can. But keep in mind, if you've got a perennial garden started, you've got some plants here, you can always divide things and do that. And worst case scenario, we always got seeds. That's it, you guys. That was a lot of questions and answers. Thank you for that. I hope you liked it. I hope this was helpful. If you like it, maybe we'll do another Q&A sometime soon. I am trying to keep the gardening videos going because I feel better talking about gardening. I think a lot of people feel better thinking about gardening. So be well, be safe. Get ready to garden. It's going to be a good year for gardening, you guys. I can guarantee it.